Hello, my name is Scott Badish. I am the President and CEO of the Autism Society of America, and it's our delight and honor to co-host this wonderful webinar called The Therapeutic Promise of CBD on Autism with the Wholistic Research and Education Foundation, along with the University of California at San Diego. I know there's a tremendous amount of people listening to this webinar, and one thing I want to start, it will be about an hour. It won't last more than an hour. Secondly, if you have questions on your page in your computer under the chat, please put those questions. Inevitably, with so many people, we will not be able to answer all the questions tonight but during this webinar, but for those that we can't, we will get back to you with the answers. I want to just say how the Autism Society of America, for those who don't know, is the oldest and largest grassroots autism agency in America. Our job is to help people maximize their quality of life, and when we partnered with the Wholistic Research and Education Foundation about CBD oil, we did it for a couple reasons. We know a number of people call us and call our call center daily wanting to know about the benefits of CBD or medical marijuana, and there's a lot of confusion out there, and we thought this would be a wonderful way to help address that confusion. And secondly, we want to help people maximize their quality of life, and if someone could make an educational decision for what's best for them or what's best for their child, we want to be there. We also want to say the Autism Society of America does not have a position on a medical marijuana or CBD oil. As you'll see from this webinar, we're working to see best practices and proven research to back up things. And we also encourage that anytime you use anything that relates to treating a person with anything, that you go to your doctors and have your physicians know about it, and hopefully this will give them research. This will be on tape, so if they want to see it, they can see it. I also want to thank the University of California, San Diego for putting on this webinar, for filming it, and thank you very much. And it's my pleasure, someone we've worked with who's just been a very wonderful person, is Palin Thorogood, who is the co-founder and president of the Wholistic Research and Education Foundation, which is the real emphasis of studying the relationship of CBD and autism. Palin, it's my pleasure to introduce you. Thank you.
We are so delighted to be connecting with families who have autism, either in their direct family or people they know people who have autism, to be able to share what we know so far, as well as how we're exploring the therapeutic promise of CBD. I am here today with MDs and researchers who have really given their life's work into understanding this, and they'll be spending they'll all be going through their presentations and going through their data to share with you guys. But before we go there, I want to give you guys a little bit of background on Wholistic, as well as provide a bit of information on what CBD is. Wholistic is California-based charitable foundation, and our focus is really understanding if and how CBD may be beneficial to many conditions, including autism. We are focused on funding both clinical and scientific data to understand the mechanisms behind how CBD may be working, and we're looking to use that research-driven data to help educational programs such as this to educate the public, as well as share that information with healthcare professionals so that there can be informed decisions made between the patient and the doctor. We're also looking to use that data for advocacy so that there can be more information on the safety of CBD usage, since it is becoming so much more common, as well as better standards around CBD usage, and use that information and share it with both state and federal regulators for safe and legal access to CBD. Once again, our focus around research, and one of the differences in our research approaches is not just focusing on clinical, but really understanding the mechanisms underneath, understanding how and why CBD may be working to help various conditions. And the education focus is very much around both focusing on the public as well as the healthcare professionals, so that there is much more of a deeper understanding of these mechanisms at play. So, what is CBD? I know many of you have been hearing about CBD from many sources, and there's, as Scott indicated, a lot of confusion around it. CBD is the non-psychoactive compound found in cannabis or hemp. It can really come from either source, but it is non-psychoactive, so it's important to understand that. And many research studies indicate that it has anti-inflammatory, anti-anxiety, antioxidative, and neuroregenerative properties, which may be the reason that it helps many conditions out there, and hence the focus of the research. And last year, November of 2017, the World Health Organization, WHO, actually produced a very comprehensive report on both the safety and the efficacy of CBD, indicated that it is safe and well tolerated in humans and animals and does not pose a health risk. It also talked about how it has been demonstrated to really help with epilepsy, as well as there is sufficient evidence out there that it may help with many other serious conditions. So there is plenty of data from around the world, and we have started doing more research in this country as well. So how does CBD work? CBD works by interacting with newly discovered biological system that all mammals have, that's called the endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system has the largest single receptor system in our whole body, and it regulates many of the body functions, including the nervous, immune, endocrine, and digestive systems. So you can see why CBD may be impacting so many different conditions, because it's really working throughout the body and with receptors all the way from our brain through many other organs as well. And based on the data, it has been shown to have at least anecdotal data, if not clinical data, to potentially treat many conditions, including anxiety and depression, many inflammatory disorders, seizures, which is probably one of the areas that CBD got most of its background, because at this point it's actually been, there's a CBD isolate drug that has been approved by FDA to treat seizures. Nausea and vomiting, many psychiatric disorders, including PTSD, and both neurodevelopmental as well as neurodegenerative disorders. So I'm going to be turning it on to one of my esteemed colleagues, a renowned geneticist and pediatrician, Dr. Keith Vox, who has been working with autism for well over 2 decades and has been actually been involved with CBD, has recommended CBD in some cases to the patients, and has seen some very interesting results. So we'll be able to share and learn from his experience over the last several decades. He's going to share some of the international research that he's seen as well. And then we're going to move to the new study that we have funded with UCSD, but more on that later. So with that, Keith. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate being on this panel. So I'm just starting off. I take most of my inspiration from my dog. So when things, get bad and you feel really tired and, that head's getting heavy, you just find a place to prop it and keep moving. So I have a foundation as well that I started. I was in at UCSD for quite a bit of my career. I am a pediatrician, and I trained as a dysmorphologist, but got into sequencing, and I've been working on sequencing for quite a while. The fascinating thing for me was that once we started sequencing, we were finding many, many associated genes, and the question always was, well, now what do I do? And I really found it to be a very in-depth and very troubling question, because I didn't really have an answer. Certainly using neuroactive drugs are what we do for the most part. Those drugs, to me, sap a lot of the life out of the patient. And in particular, patients that have autism who have fulfilled every inch of my life. I have a family member that's on the spectrum who's done great. And so to see what the treatments we have do to somebody was really heartbreaking to me. So it really got me motivated to want to look for alternatives and other ways to explore what's happening. So I started a foundation with the help of a couple of my friends, and we focus mainly on exploring novel treatments. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and I've actually probably done most of my career this way, probably to the detriment of my working for corporate medicine, but anyway, it's another story. So this is from Thomas Kuhn. Science is not a steady cumulative process, but a series of peaceful interludes, which is what we've been in, punctuated by intellectually violent revolutions, which is where I think we're heading with autism treatment. I think that the standard therapy is doing a disservice to everybody, and I think we're looking at a paradigm shift coming up, and I would like to be part of that. So I went over a little bit of the history first, because I think it's important to remember that we practice medicine. We don't know medicine, we practice medicine. So you always have to be learning, you always have to be exploring, but you also need to understand the giants that came before you and know that they knew a lot of stuff that we've forgotten and that we need to relearn. One of my great friends is out in the audience, and we're learning so much through the work that she's done about diet and nutrition. I mean, how many times has your doctor talked to you about diet and nutrition? Never. We forgot that. We forgot how important that is. And so I'm bringing this up because cannabis has been around and cultivated by humans as long as we have knowledge of what has happened to us. So, you can go anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 years and see that there was cannabis involved in holistic treatments and faith healing and all kinds of different activities. It appeared in one of the most amazing books probably ever written about medicine by a Persian in the 900s, which basically cataloged every known substance that was used in healing at the time. It's an incredible read if you ever have a chance to look at it. And then in the 1830s, an Irish physician actually brought cannabis to the West, which was Europe at the time, and used it for treatment. And it actually got to the point where the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, cannabis was a regularly prescribed treatment. So was opium, and so was willow bark. Those were kind of the big guys that everybody had. This is a photo that shows each, you can't really read them, but this is what the doctors carried around as they went from house to house treating their patients. So you had opium, you had willow bark, which is aspirin, and you had cannabis, and that took care of your anxiety and your stomach pain, some of your gastrointestinal complaints. This is well published. It's all over the literature from that time, but we've forgotten it. I also probably have that same bag. I think that hasn't changed a bit. I don't know if I put my computer in it now, but. So this is when the big change started. And for me, and for all of us that practice, we sometimes feel like drug pushers, but we push them basically on a result of what happened here. So salicylic acid was isolated from willow bark, and in 1899, Bayer patented it. They put an acetyl body on the edge of the salicylic acid, and then that became a patentable item, and that was aspirin. And that's been the first real blockbuster drug. It's still the biggest selling drug in the world. They don't make any money off it, but it's still huge. Again, as I mentioned, opium and marijuana also came into use right around the same time. But what happened was the opium use became so common that the physicians stopped using it. There was a lot of pressure to move into these other manufactured drugs. Again, something we're seeing right now, again, as history tends to repeat itself. So at the turn of the century, about 1 in 200 U.S. citizens were addicted to opium at that time. We're not quite there, but we're getting there quick. So the government started to step in and regulate what was prescribable by physicians. And there was the Narcotic Act in 1914, and then marijuana got into it at that point too. What happened with the Narcotic Act was it was an anti-opium act, and then marijuana became the go-to drug. So it was sort of perceived as not quite as classy as opium, so they quickly regulated that. It was officially banned in 1970, and then again banned even harder during the Anti-Drug Abuse Act and with the Reagans, both in 1986 and 88. It became an offense that was jailable at that point. Prior to this, it wasn't usually something you got arrested for. But what was interesting for us is that then it became illegal to prescribe it as well, and with the accompanying jail time. And as we tend to do, California and Oregon, two of the more progressive states legalized medical use despite the federal regulations, California in 1995. And again, this is an important background because from 2001 to 2010, there were 8.2 million marijuana arrests in the U.S., and that's 50% of all drug arrests. That's just crazy. So when you try to get your doctor to talk about marijuana, this is the background that they're using. Now, we've gotten to the point where this year there are now 46 states that allow medical use of marijuana and many states that allow recreational use. The problem is that we're still licensed federally, and this is still a Class 1 medication. Therefore, we cannot ever prescribe it. It's illegal for us to prescribe it. There's a workaround, which is recommending it, but again, in most states, if the federal government decided to change what they were doing, we would all be prosecutable if we ever wrote it as a prescription. Now, that's the way I feel about this, because my patients, the patients that I spend each and every day caring for and up at night worrying about, are taking a substance that I can't talk to them about. And so I feel that I have all this good knowledge about cannabis, but I can't say anything. So I'm just banging my head against the chalkboard. But I see patients, even today, I have a young man who's 15. He suffered epilepsy since he was born. I've had him for about 2 years now. He was on a very, very, very strong regimen of psychoactive medications, prescribable medications, and he couldn't do anything. He couldn't read. He just sat in his bed and did nothing. So we started to wean those medications, and the recommendation using one of the naturopathic physicians that I've collaborated with was to go to CBD, 20-to-1 CBD THC, which is a one similar to Charlotte's Web, which I'll talk about just briefly. I saw him today. Despite having roseola, he did not have any episodes of seizures on only CBD. Now, in the past, when he got fevers, he would have large series of epilepsy events and would usually stop breathing and would end up in the hospital. We were able to get him home last night just by giving him an extra dose of CBD. So, again, as a scientist, I don't want to hear myself say, so see, it works, but in his case, it certainly was much more beneficial to him than the medications he was on before. It's also important when you are trying to communicate with your physician that you understand what the terms are. I just briefly went through this. Palin explained this briefly, but there's the cannabis plant itself. And the two main types are the first two on there, and there's a third one that's coming into action now. There's growers and cultivators who are good, and growers and cultivators who are not so good. So it's very important that that you understand what the plants are. Marijuana itself is the dried cannabis plant. So it includes the leaves, the flowers, the stems, and the seeds. That's different than hemp. Hemp does also have CBD in it, but there'll be more on that at a later point. So cannabis has, right now, we understand about 400 substances in it, and somewhere in the 100 to 150 of the substances are cannabinoid type substances. The ones that you've all heard of and the ones that are most studied are the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is THC, and that's the neuroactive portion of it. The cannabidiol, or CBD, works on the pathway that Palin mentioned. And there's two others that are coming into use. There's the D8 THC and the CBN, and both of those you're going to hear a lot about them coming up. The really fascinating thing, and I'm just going to touch on this is the endocannabinoid system itself. And we're starting to just understand it, and I have a partial understanding of it, but I heard it best described as most of our neurons, for obvious reasons, are active. They're under constant stimulation and constant activity. It makes sense, if the ball's coming at you, you don't want to have to start the engine and wait for things to happen. You want to be able to dodge it. So the endocannabinoid system downregulates that normal activity, and therefore for kids that we deal with, kids with autism, kids with ADHD, kids with intellectual disabilities, that regulation piece is really what's at heart here. So being able to calm yourself down. So again, I sometimes feel like this as well. I'm watching my shows at home and I don't really want to go to work, but we've all seen this. So we've all seen this kind of activity. This young man's having a meltdown. Again, with the active medicines that we have, you don't want to have to give this kid Ativan or something similar to that. It would be nice to have something that would be able to calm down that situation and allow him to function. So how about the data itself? So with epilepsy, the data has been very clear to the point where the FDA approved a cannabinoid CBD derivative medication that can be prescribed, and that's down at the bottom. But we don't have the same good studies with autism. Part of the problem with that is that there's not a autism. With epilepsy, you have an EEG signature that you can show improvement. With autism, as the saying goes, once you've seen a child with autism, you've seen a child with autism. That makes it very difficult to do scientific studies of any type. However, Israel, as with many things, has led the way in this. They see and recognize that this medication is very powerful. So Dr. Aron in 2018 published this retrospective review of 60 of his patients. They were taking a very similar one to Charlotte's Web, 20% CBD, 1% THC. They were observed for 7 months. They had some pre-testing and some post-testing. And the results were just astronomical. So they were an 80% decrease in the parent-reported problematic behavior. Now, the one thing that's important to say in this is that these were kids that did not respond to standard neuroactive medications. They were not responders to any of the meds we normally use. So this is even larger with that in mind. There's a 50% increase in communication with the parent by their report. So 40% decrease in self-reported anxiety. And for a lot of us, this is a big point, which is 30% decrease in parental anxiety, which is a major bonus, as you know. Now, this was not a controlled trial. There would not be anyone that would be able to say this is scientific proof. It's, the patients essentially are self-selected. But it's a very promising start, and hopefully, with the group here today, we'll be able to make more scientific, definitive statements about this. So again, I want to emphasize that the epilepsy data is clear from a scientific standpoint. It is there. So Charlotte's Web being the model of this particular one, this is a 20% CBD to 1% THC. That seems to make the CBD more functional in this particular setup. As I mentioned, there is an FDA-approved medication for these two very rare epilepsy syndromes, but it's going to be used more in the future. I also just want to briefly touch on Marinol, which has been around forever. This is a synthetic THC. This is used for diet, for stimulation of diet, particularly in cancer patients, and then in some eating disorder patients, it's starting to get used. So this also points to some promise in that area. So that's basically the summary of my talk. I have somewhere north of 200 patients that are actively on the medication. I have had, again, very good results with it from parent reports. But I'm really excited that this project is happening. I think we have a team together that's really going to make a difference here. This is another young gentleman that ended up the family moved to Colorado to get Charlotte's Web for 300 plus seizures per day that the young gentleman was having, and he has none moving forward. This is one of the cultivators. It's become a whole science now. It's like a brewer. They really concoct these plants in an incredible fashion. So I have placed, or I will place this afternoon on my website, some references that I brought up here. There's some fascinating articles on animal studies and THC, but again, we're just moving forward with the autism group. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. That was great. So before I invite Dr. Alysson Muotri, I wanted to emphasize and just dive into two areas that Keith talked about. First of all, the fact that CBD can come from two different genomes. The cannabis plant, which has a higher percentage of THC, as well as hemp, which has less than 0.3% THC. And you can get CBD from both. The other point is the fact that both hemp and cannabis are bioremediators, as in they can actually extract what's in the soil, which means if the soil is not organic, if it has pesticides, if it has heavy metals, that can actually go into the plant. So it's really important to focus on using organic hemp, organic cannabis, especially given this is to be used for medical purposes, for wellness. So that's a really important point. The second point I wanted to talk about, and that's a great segue into the UCSD study that we're going to talk about, is the fact that, and as Keith indicated, there are not a lot of studies on this, but even the studies we have are primarily around clinical data. And as we saw from the Israeli study, which is wonderful that we have that data, is it shows that CBD or THC or a combination thereof works for X percentage of the kids to deliver, lower anxiety, better behavior, etc. But what we don't know is how it works. So what we really wanted to do as Wholistic is to drive research that goes into the underlying mechanisms so we can understand why it may be helping specific kids, what are some of the perhaps genetic commonalities, what is the neuroscience behind it helping. So what we're doing in collaboration with UCSD is truly a first of its kind study to understand the mechanisms at play so that hopefully we'll be able to not just see how much CBD may help, but to whom it helps and what are the mechanisms, so we can not just use this for autism, but for many other neurodevelopmental diseases as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Alysson Muotri, who is going to talk about the research that we've started, as well as a very exciting part of it that he is personally leading. He is one of the principal investigators of the study, one of the 3 principal investigators. So thank you.
Thank you, Paley, and thank you for organizing this meeting. I think this is very helpful for the families and people who are online are curious about the CBD and exactly how it acts in brain cells. And that's my job here, is try to figure out exactly how this molecule that can be extracted from those plants, how that can affect your behavior in some of these neurological conditions. So, but before I jump into that, I'll summarize, the aims or the goals of these studies. And the first thing is really to determine, using clinical evidence, if CBD is safe, tolerable, and if alleviates some of the symptoms of autism. And we will be talking about a specific type of autism that are the most severe type of autism. These are traditionally more difficult to study because the behavior, the stress on the families to participate on this kind of studies. But we are all making an effort to include the more severe types of autism, and we think that's when the benefit might become more evident. So we're going to be recruiting autistic individuals who have like aggressive behavior, hyperactivity, and low level of social communication. So the second goal, or the second aim of these studies, is to determine if the potential mechanism of action of CBD actually relates to the alterations in neurotransmitters or how the neurons communicate to each other, improvements in the neurophysiological normalities that we see in these neuronal networks, and overall, if there is any improvement in brain connectivity. So there are plenty of evidence suggesting that autistic individuals have alterations in these brain communications. So we are designing our study to really prove if CBD can act on that. And I think finally, and perhaps one of unique aims of this is to determine whether there are biomarkers for neuroinflammation that are affected by CBD administration in autistic individuals. So that would be really helpful moving forward to identify the population of autistic children and even adults that might be more susceptible to this kind of treatment. So this is a truly multidisciplinary approach. There are many disciplines that are involved on that. There are clinical and neurophysiological evaluation that would be done before and after treatment. Would do the intervention using synthetic CBD initially in 30 children with severe type of autism, as I said. The clinical part is going to be led by Doris Trauner, who is also a professor in the neuroscience department at UCSD. Then finally, we move on into the more mechanistic, molecular, cellular analysis of CBD acting on brain cells. To do that, we're taking advantage of a very interesting technology that involves stem cell biology, and this is by reprogramming cells from the subjects that are participating in our study and reprogramming them in the lab, creating what we call induced pluripotent stem cells. These stem cells can be driven to specialize into the brain cells, so we can study the effect of CBD in these brain cells derived from each one of the individuals that are participating in our study. And finally, we're going to hear a little bit later on the analysis of these networks that we can collect it in a very dynamic way, because these are live cells in the lab, and this will be done by Dr. Gabe Silvia here at UCSD. So the clinical study, it's quite simple. It's very similar to many of the clinical studies that perhaps you hear about or are familiar about. So these would be 30 kids with severe type of autism that would be pre-screened in between ages of 8 and 12 years old. It's going to be a randomized crossover trial of CBD versus placebo. So we're going to know exactly, if there is a positive effect on top of placebo here. And both cognitive and behavioral tests would be done before and after treatment. So we're going to be collecting lots of data regarding social behavior, language, all type of stereotypes as well. Also, importantly, we're going to be collecting brainwave activity. This is what you can extract using electroencephalogram or EEG. Also eye tracking, and we're going to be measuring some of these movements, spontaneous movements that individuals with autism will often have. And finally, we're going to have several types of brain scan on resting state for kids with that are part of the trial before and after the treatment. So overall, we're going to be collecting tons of clinical data, and I think the challenge is to collect these, to connect this clinical data with the molecular cellular analysis that would be done in vitro in the lab. So I briefly touch on the idea that we can reprogram cells from all the subjects participating on the trial, and we can induce the cells to differentiate into brain cells. Most of the time, we do that in 3 dimensions, and these cells self-organize in something that we call a brain organoid. Most of the time, you're going to see in the media that they call these mini brains. It's not a very good name because they don't actually look like a mini brain, but it's a cluster of cells that have electrical activity going on, and they self-organize on something that resemble the human brain. And before I move on, I want to make very clear that as any other model to study the human brain, there are limitations. And these are the potential limitations that we anticipate. Most of the time, when we specialize in these neurons in the lab, they are more immature neurons compared to the neurons that you have in the brain. These organoids are not vascularized, not all cell types are represented. We don't even know if the conditions that we are growing these organoids are ideal. And finally, we don't know if what we learn into the tissue culture in vitro can translate to the human brain. So the translational potential of these technologies is still unknown, and that's why this study is so important. It is the first one that will be able to connect the in vitro data towards the subjects in a clinical trial. So I do think that this technology will be disruptive in the way we understand neurodevelopment, autism, and the impact of CBD on social human behavior. So the way we create these mini brains, we follow a recipe that has been developed in my lab for the past years. We start with these pluripotent reprogrammed cells from each individual. So each one of these cells will capture the entire genome information for each one of the subjects. And through a series of process and media and factors, we guide these cells to self-assemble in 3D floating structures that, again, resemble a very mature human brain. And that's what we call a brain organoid. These brain organoids, they can mature for long periods of time, and we have been collecting data from them. The way they self-organize is quite interesting. In the video here, what you see are some of the progenitor cells that are migrating out of the center of this colony. And as they migrate out, these neural progenitor cells will stop, will differentiate, and start forming connections to each other, forming what we call the cortical plate. The cortex in the human brain is the center of most of the sophisticated cognition that we have, and is one of the brain regions affected in autism. So for these particular studies, we're going to be focusing on the cortex. So we can measure the activity of these organoids by plating them on dishes that contains multi-electrode arrays printed in the bottom of the dishes. All the time when there is activity passing through these electrodes, we can capture that and generate an activity map. So we can simulate how the networks are firing, or how the neurons are being active and connecting to each other by studying these kind of networks. And Gabe Silva will tell you more what we can do with this data later on. So very surprisingly, we learned that we can keep these brain organoids for long periods of the time. And as we do that, they age in a way that is very similar to human development, reaching to a point where the activity is super high. For example, in the first graphic here, I have time from 2 months to 10 months, and the number of spikes or activity from those neurons are moving from 3,000 per second to a little bit over 300,000 per second. So there is a time frame where the networks really get organized and become super active. And because we have such an amount of activity, these networks start to generate brain oscillations. And these oscillations is what we can detect it by using EEGs. And so that will be the basis of our comparison with the clinical data. The clinical data, all the subjects will have the EEGs done before and after treatment. And we can use the EEG collected from the subject's brain organoids and be able to compare that with before and after CBD treatment. So virtually what we are doing is running the clinical trial in parallel, in vitro, in the lab, and hoping we can match the data that we have with the clinical data. By doing that, not only we can see who are the responders and non-responders, we can actually search on the genome what are the potential genetic variants that account for these differences. And we can also test many different concentrations and doses of CBD and THC to actually personalize the treatment for each individual. So that would be something closer to a personalized treatment for each one of them. So this is just one example of how the networks changes over time. So I'll stop here and pass to Gabe Silva to talk a little bit more about the system
before
approach.
Dr. Silva speaks, I just wanted you to clarify something for our audience. Where do you get the induced pluripotent stem cells?
Yeah, so the induced pluripotent stem cells will be reprogrammed from a small 3 millimeter skin biopsy from each one of the subjects.
Okay,
so these
so it's
are
coming from the
fibroblasts
skin directly.
from the skin cells. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So, and for the opportunity to participate. So just to pick up where Alysson left off, I'm a theoretical and computational neuroscientist, and one of the things that we've done is we've essentially developed, so this is sort of the most innovative, kind of far-reaching part of this study. We are going to take Alysson's models, the organoids that they're deriving from the individual patients actually participating in the clinical trial, and carry out a sort of very new, rather sophisticated mathematical analysis of how information flows through individual neurons and then through networks of neurons in a dish, essentially, and the types of organoids that Alysson was showing. So what we've done is we have a set of we have a mathematical theory, a set of mathematical equations essentially that says something about how signals propagate through a network, how information flows through a network. And what we've been able to identify is that there has to be a balance between the nodes, the internal components in the network, how they're holding on to information as they process that, and then the rate at which, the speed at which information is propagating through the whole network, right? So when that balance breaks down, we've shown in simulations and again sort of mathematically that there's a breakdown in information processing. And we've recently shown that in typical neurons, in normal neurons, this ratio, this balance, which we call the refraction ratio, between this information processing within individual nodes and the speed of information flow within the network, that ratio is an optimization principle that neurons are actually designed, they're optimized for. Their structure, their actual shape is optimized to for that ratio. And that's basically precisely what we want to test in as part of this study related to CBD and autism. So we will take Dr. Muotri's organoids and neurons that, and again, these are very, each individual patient in the study will have organoids derived from their own skin cells, basically, and we are going to carry out this analysis and look at this ratio in the individual patients. And depending on what that analysis shows, both positive and negative results will actually teach us something about the underlying physiology. How is information changing? How is it different in these patient-derived autistic networks? The ultimate dream, if you will be to be able to almost predict which one of these patients will respond clinically. Now that's sort of the pipe dream. That's the ultimate objective. But if we understand enough in terms of network signaling, what's happening in these organoid models and in these neurons from these patients, we may be able to actually inform that both before and after sort of the treatment with CBD.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you thank you very much. We have some time for some questions, and extremely informative. This is the second time I've been through it, and I learned a lot, so thank you. I guess my first question would be, and knowing some of the questions we're seeing, is explain, a lot of people are worried about getting involved with anything that relates to the hemp plant or the cannabis, about the THC and high. Explain how, when you talked about CBD oil, how this is not something that if they give it to their child, take themselves, they're going to have the high that's usually associated with marijuana.
I'll start, and please you guys add, especially Keith, since you've certainly seen a lot of patients with it. As I mentioned before, CBD, cannabidiol, is the non-psychoactive compound, one of the 150 plus cannabinoids found in the cannabis plant, whether it's coming from marijuana, the one that has a higher amount of THC, or whether it's coming from hemp, which has very minimal amount of THC. Many of the products that you see in the markets, certainly in California and many other states as well, they are coming because they are extracted from hemp, and many of them are whole plant, which is actually our focus and what we promote. And they are, since they're coming from hemp, they have to have legally less than 0.3% THC, which means it's not going to make you high. It's not going to make your kids high. So that's what we have seen, Keith, please add to that.
Right. Yeah. The product that'll be used in this is terrific, and we haven't seen that kind of psychoactive effect. The other products that we do recommend on some points can be up 2 to 1, though there is some effect from the THC at that point. So this is very carefully designed to look at the CBD component, not the THC.
Thanks.
Even though we do, in the future, we may add additional elements and look at other cannabinoids as well, because they're, plants work together. There are many compounds in the plants. This study is primarily focused on CBD, but we do believe there is a whole plant effect in general.
And I should mention that our 4 distinguished panelists have no monetary interest in any product sold by CBD oil. This is all about, I think, as you said, so Palin, and the doctor, you want to make sure it's safe. If people use it, you want to make sure it's effective. So on the effective, let me ask the scientists a question, or either, or anyone. Someone said, I think the doctor said, you met one person with autism, you met one person. When Palin and I, before, we were talking about, because one type of medicine or something may help me, it may not help Palin for the same cause. So explain that if someone goes out tomorrow and buys CBD oil and they say, wait, my son's anxiety is still there, or still having seizures, why is that going to happen?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's why the design that we have in this study is so powerful, because clinical trials are expensive, they are long, and the conclusions are tricky, because let's suppose that in our clinical trial, one of the 30 patients actually benefit from CBD. We will consider a failed clinical trial. But it might be that because we are using a single dose and a single molecule, the other patients might benefit from a slightly different dose or slightly different combinations of CBD plus THC. So this is all the things that can be done in vitro. Would be really hard to do in a clinical trial, but we can personalize the treatment for each one of them. More importantly, I think what we're going to see is, because autism is such a variable condition, we're going to see that the data is all over the place. It might work really well for some of the people. It might not work for others. And then there is the whole in-between response that we're going to find. I really think that by doing the genome sequencing in each one of them and comparing with the clinical data and the in vitro data, we might be able to learn more why are these responses so variable. Is it the expression of the receptors, or polymorphism, genetic polymorphism on these receptors? So these are the kind of questions that is only possible because we have the in vitro study being done in parallel.
Yeah, and this is the dream personalized medicine trial, because all the other medications we have are done on a population. So Palin and I would be given the same medication, even though I'm 3 times bigger than her. So
Probably
maybe
not.
more. But what we're able to do in this trial is you're actually studying the effect of the medication on that individual's actual brain tissue. I mean, it's the best model we have. Obviously, we can't get a whole brain. But
And I'm not sure if this was clear in Alysson's presentation, but per child, so there are 30 kids in the clinical trial, you may have thousands of mini brains, which means you have thousands of variations of dosage and frequency you can try on each child and each genome. So that's a crazy amount of testing you can do in vitro to be able to then feed back into the clinical trial or into just, overall our experiences. So I feel like the power there is just a number of iterations we can make.
The only other comment I'll add is that with a clinical trial of an N of 30, the statistical power of that, especially given the heterogeneity of, sort of it's autism spectrum for a reason. The interpretation of that data, to Alyson's point, would be extremely difficult. So this is a way of really sort of leveraging the clinical component in the best way possible scientifically.
And this, just so we know, because we've all talked about that the end result is to provide an option to a parent, to an individual, on if they have a need, if they have anxiety, they can't sleep at night, here's something that could happen. So my next question, which has been asked, how do you take CBD oil? I mean, I get calls from the office, when someone says medical marijuana, they assume a 3-year-old smoking a cigarette or something. But how is CBD oil administered?
Well, it can be administered in many ways, but typically these days it's coming in the form of oils. May come in, say, like MCT coconut oil or many other, it might be infused into different types of oils. It might come in tinctures. It can come in topicals. So there are many, many ways. And there are many products out there. There are many reputable products out there. There are probably some that are not so reputable because there is not sufficient standardization. There is no actual real testing out there, which is one of our goals as a foundation, is to really bring that safety mechanism so that what we know what we're buying, that it really indeed has the amount of CBD that it says on there, and hopefully not much else.
Right, I agree with that. It's the most popular one is the little gummy versions. So, but oils are very common. I like the oils, especially the good tasting oils.
Yes.
So you put the oil on the tongue and...
Yeah, and it's absorbed quite quickly. So.
But yeah, topicals as well. But I mean, I think in autism, oil would be better, whereas topicals are usually used for pain and things like that.
And just, I know we got a few minutes left, but you mentioned advocacy about how
Yes.
one of the roles of the foundation, of course, it's a key role of our organization. If the people listening, we get a lot of calls of, would you endorse under the medical marijuana, whatever state, the inclusion of medical marijuana for autism? And as I said at the beginning, we have no position on this yet. But what would you tell people out there if for a, on a public policy issue? Doctor, you said, the federal government still controls a lot, so you're limited to what you could do. What would be the one thing you would say to them that if they want to promote the advancement of CBD oil as an option for themselves, for their child, on an advocacy and public policy they could do?
To me, what we've seen with epilepsy is the stories. When people share their stories about how it has helped them and provide some detail about what they used, how they used it, so we understand at least their personal protocols, because once again, every story is going to be different, which is why we're trying to understand the personalized effects. So I think sharing those stories, so everyone, the public, the politicians, the healthcare professionals understand the situations where it worked and, and what kind of protocol was used. I think that'd be really helpful.
So let me just ask, because I'm looking at time, we've had some talks. What do you tell the parent or the individual who tells their doctor, I want to explore CBD, and the doctor doesn't know anything? What do you say to that person? Other than go to another doctor, I guess, but I don't want to suggest that. But what would you say? What's the best way for that parent to advocate, or the individual to advocate to their doctor or their medical profession, about, hey, I want you to help me figure out if this is the right thing for myself or my child? As no one wants to answer it.
Yeah. Well, it's a very tough one, and especially in the present healthcare environment where it's a throughput model. But this is one of the things that those of us that do primary care really want to capture, is how we can return to a partnership between the physician and the family. So I always encourage my patients to enter into a discussion about things that they're doing. The worst thing you could do is not tell somebody. And that lack of trust with your physician is a major red flag. And I've had a lot of people that didn't tell me right away, and I said, it's very important for me to be able to guide you, and I want to know everything you're doing. I want to know what your diet is. I want to know what kind of supplements you take. I want to know what you're doing, because that's the only way to guide you. So in order for it to change overall, the federal licensing has to change. That's the key to it all, because without us being able to actually prescribe it, it's gone elsewhere. So it's gone to holistic providers and things like that. And there's value in that, but there's not value in having 10 different doctors. There's value in having one doctor that knows your family. So I think it's advocating for education and knowledge for this and many other things. But
I know our time is up. This has been fascinating. I want to thank the four of you. Palin, thank you for just saying we need to do something and putting money behind your actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing this information with with the families that you work with every day. And thank you for everything you do for them.
Well, thank you. And again, just for those out there, we will try to answer all the questions. It may take a while. Some we may not be able to answer. And again, one of the things we want to know is we want to be there from the Autism Society. We have a national call center, 1-800-3-AUTISM, to help people get services, get involved with your local Autism Society for help, support, assistance. And again, God bless you guys. Thank you. Thank you to University of California at San Diego, and happy holidays and happy New Year to everyone.
Thank you. And we'll be sharing this recorded link with everyone. So if there's any part you want to listen again, you can do so. Thanks again.
Thank you to our crowd.